I heard from great. Oh no, call it.
If you have everyone wouldn't mind muting themselves, that'll help us out. Francesca, did we lose you?
No, I'm here.
Okay, there you are. Okay, great. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to an Oft-Repeated Anecdote, a program of the Palisades Free Library. I'm Emily, the Adult Services Librarian, and I'm hosting tonight's program. If you could please keep yourself muted during the presentation so we don't get any background noise. We'll have some Q&A at the end, and you can unmute at that point and ask your questions, or you can just type your questions into the chat as we go along, and I'll make sure that they're answered. Our guest this evening is Francesca Costa. Francesca has a graduate degree from the University of Edinburgh, and she is a full-time public historian at the Palisades Interstate Park and supervises the park's interpretive ranger program. Francesca, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the program. I'm joined here with Christina Riccutti, one of my interpretive rangers, and she's heard me go off about this topic a lot, and it's wonderful that I get a chance to share it with all of you folks. So just to get things started, an oft-repeated anecdote, the Rockefeller and the Palisades. You might have heard us talk a lot about the Palisades before, but this is a specific program about specifically the Rockefeller's influence on us, and also a few myths, and also the truths lying under the surface about the Rockefeller family and their connection to us. If you have any questions, feel free to write it in the chat. Like Emily said, I'll be sure to get to it at the end. Just setting the scene here, this is the Palisades Interstate Park in New Jersey. This is where Christina and I work. We actually had a nice hike today and were able to see it in all its glory. It was a beautiful day out. So this is 12 miles of Hudson Riverfront that has been saved from all sorts of development. And there is a long history of development along this area and also in New York City. I found this. It was an absolutely wonderful illustration of New York City from the 1800s, I believe mid-1800s or later 1800s. And you can actually see the Palisades ridgeline extending. I don't know if everyone can see my mouse, but it extends all the way up. This is actually the tip of Manhattan. This is the other end of Manhattan down here. You can see Central Park in here. And then all of this is Palisades land. And in this map, you can actually see that not only is there heavy development along the riverfront. I believe this is Staten Island down here. So extending up from that, I believe this is Jersey City area. But even as far up here, you can actually see some development along here. Further up, it gets a little bit more pastoral. We start to see all sorts of family estates, usually summer mansions, but it is developed right on that top. And there isn't anything to suggest that it wasn't developed down below. We actually spend a lot of our time studying the folks who lived along the riverfront. So a lot of people see the park and they think that it's preserving some sort of primeval forest that was always there. And that's not the case. It was very well lived in. And all of this is actually new growth and new forests, which is actually a delight to experience. Here's another map. You can actually see this is Inwood up here. This is the tip of Manhattan down here. So around halfway down over here, this is where eventually there would be a George Washington Bridge in this area. And you can see the Palisades extending up. One thing you might notice, just like I talked about, I'm not lying to you folks, you can actually see these developments right along the riverfront. And also developments on top. Of course, this map isn't necessarily accurate. Where they're drawing structures, there might not have literally been structures there. But all this to say, people who were drawing this map, people who knew this area, knew that there was development going on. Today, we actually boast all sorts of wonderful recreational activities free from development. You can see all sorts of wonderful views. We have all sorts of kayaking beaches. We have boating areas, boat launches. We have hiking trails. We have some more difficult hiking trails if you're interested. And a lot of times when these hikers come up to us, or these, boaters, picnickers, you name it, they already know one thing about us, and that's about it. So they come up to us, and this is what they say. We often hear this. I heard it so often, it's basically the second thing that they say after, "Where's the bathroom?" Right?
Yeah.
So after we tell them where the bathroom is, I always like to gently correct folks that this is actually a myth. Rockefeller didn't necessarily make this park, and there are a few different pitfalls. When you are interpreting history, there are a few pitfalls to fall into, and this actually covers a few of them. So I thought it would make a very interesting presentation, because there's actually a lot we can learn. Even though this isn't true, we can learn a lot from the myth. So there is this fallacy of great men of history. Basically, it boils down to the fact that it's far easier to remember one name than it is some sort of complicated network. This happens everywhere. It's a pretty common fallacy. Even things like, oh, Washington crossing the Delaware. It was an army crossing the Delaware, but it boils down to one man instead of like the larger force. So it's not necessarily, it's not bad in concept, but it can lead to misleading quotes. Like sometimes we often hear either J.P. Morgan or Rockefeller built this park. Another myth is that J.P. Morgan built this park. He bought up all 12 miles of land down by the river. And so he built this park. That is also not true. As Christina and I know, it's hard to sort of explain it away from someone if they don't really have any background in the subject. But it's more complicated than that. Of course, there are parks that Rockefeller single-handedly built, like Acadia National Park, Colonial Williamsburg, but in this case, it's a little bit more complicated. The Palisades always is in some way or another. Okay, so another thing that always seems to win out in conversations for historical interpretations, especially when you're dealing with people who basically listen to an interpreter and remember maybe 5 key things from them. Usually the scandalous story is what people remember. And this is true anywhere. That's how gossip works, But in the interpretation of history, how it works is Rockefeller bought up all that land so he would have a great view. That's a scandalous story. It's something that you can believe a rich person would possibly do. Another one, Rockefeller built the parkway to sell gasoline. We've heard that quite a bit as well. At the time, we'll get into it more, but suffice to say that both of these are only very small parts of a larger truth, or they're not entirely accurate at all, like the parkway and gasoline story. Another pitfall is avoiding conflating 2 different things. We actually see this a lot as far as our origin. There's actually 2 separate origin myths for us that happen about 30 years apart. And also Rockefeller. I've been saying Rockefeller this whole time. There's more than one Rockefeller in this story. The Rockefeller that people most know is actually John D. Rockefeller Jr., and he was very philanthropic. But our story actually starts with the first Rockefeller. Here are both of them together, father and son, both John D. Rockefeller, one senior, one junior. And our story actually begins in the 1890s, and there is a major fear of development along the bottom of the cliffs. Specifically, there is a fear that all sorts of different companies are coming in with dynamite and they're blasting the cliffs for quarrying purposes. So we get quotes like this from Teddy Roosevelt: "The Palisades should be preserved. They form one of the most striking and beautiful features of nature in the entire country, and their marring and ruin should be a source not merely of regret, but of shame to our people." So this quote was when he was actually governor of New York, and he actually grew up admiring the Palisades. He hiked around on the Billings estate, which would later become Fort Tryon Park. And he also would have sailed up and down the river and been very, very familiar with the Palisades themselves. So it's very close to Theodore Roosevelt's heart that these things be preserved. In this same time period, you see quotes like, "Huge factory, oh, here the hand of man has reached out and scarred and destroyed the picturesqueness of the cliffs. Huge factory chimneys rise against jagged quarries. Wretched Italian settlements are crowding out the old estates, and soon nothing of the old-time charms will remain." So for someone with the last name Riccutti and someone named Costa, this was a little surprising, but it wasn't an uncommon thought. So this both combines the fear of these Palisades, like the face of it being marred, with fear of new developments on top of the cliffs. So when the park is actually dedicated and is open to the public in 1909, they solved the problem of the quarries. They bought up all the land on the bottom, but the land on top would be saved for a different generation. That would be in the 1930s that we acquire that land. And part of it is the opening of the bridge. It adds this new fear that this land will become developed much faster than previously anticipated. So that's where John D. Rockefeller comes in. His father actually donated land or donated money to the park to begin with in 1900, but by the 1930s, John D. Rockefeller Jr. is buying up land on top of the cliffs. Mind you, our park had already been established for around 30 years at that point. So he was actually adding to our lands, not building it himself. Along with the Rockefellers, both of them, there was a very strong network of citizens involved in this project, including the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs, who actually pushed politically on politicians during the late 1890s. And this is the view that they were trying to save. They were aghast that these blasting practices were happening in the turn of the century. And noticed that the top of the cliffs, while they weren't necessarily paved over into wretched Italian settlements, you can actually see houses up there. And you can see that this is mainly clear cut with some small trees. So by the year 1900, the Women's Club and other groups had their way, and they convinced both Theodore Roosevelt, the governor of New York, and Foster Voorhees, the governor of New Jersey, to sign on to legislation that would preserve these Palisades forever. The Palisades Interstate Park Commission would then be allowed through both states to purchase properties along the riverfront. They ended up purchasing around 12 miles of Hudson riverfront, saving it from development, saving it from quarries, but they didn't buy up a lot of land on top of the cliffs. So this is where we pivot. The story of our park foundation is also tied to a few different other organizations as well. One of them being Kaikit. This is one of the views from Kaikit, looking north, I believe. I couldn't find a really good photo of it looking south, but there's a beautiful view of the city as well. So one of the myths that we always hear is that Rockefeller bought up all the land for the Palisades to preserve a good view from his own villa. There's actually an earlier estate, it burns down by 1902. And remember, that's only, they bought this property before the Palisades was in existence as a concept. It's all being blasted away by the time they're buying this property. Kaikit was built from 1906 and it's finally finished by 1914. And it is a wonderful place for the Rockefellers, like their seat. By the time it opens to the public, excuse me, there are press releases that oftentimes they combine a lot of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s wishes for the Palisades. So it says, roughly a fifth of that land is now a state park. Saving the Palisades from development, a major project of John D. Rockefeller Jr., preserved not only that line of bold cliffs, but also a pristine view from Kaikit. And they also show how to pronounce it. So already you're seeing, as they're releasing this to the public, they're actually tying our two organizations together, which it's beautiful in a way because we are connected. Over here, this is another press release, I believe, from a year later. Kaikit means lookout in Dutch and is aptly named for its vantage point above the Hudson River, overlooking the rugged cliffs of the Palisades. John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil creator and philanthropist, together with his son John D. Rockefeller Jr., loved the view so much that they worked with landscapers to build hilltop terraces on all sides of the house in order to see the view from anywhere on the estate. Now that I definitely believe. It is an absolutely stunning view. What I don't necessarily believe is the claim that they did it only for their house. That would be an extreme misuse of those funds, I believe. There's also another problem. An organization over here on this side of the river already contradicts any claims by Kaikit that they did it for the Rockefeller estate. So the cloisters, here is a photo of when it was first created. It's from the 1930s. It actually claims this. In 1917, John D. Rockefeller Jr. bought the Billings Mansion and began developing the property. Rockefeller even purchased land on the New Jersey side of the Hudson, now known as the Palisades State Park, to preserve Fort Tryon's stunning views. Rockefeller donated the land to the city in 1931, and it was designated parkland the same year. So folks, this is live on the NYC Parks website, and seeing it, I was really sort of confused. They didn't really source where they got their information from, and I wanted to dig further into the what Fort Tryon Park, or I'm sorry, not Fort Tryon Park, what the Cloisters was saying. So here's actually, I believe, where they sourced that information, and it's for the National Historic Register, the National Register of Historic Places. This is all just public information, you can find it. And so I found this that said, even before Mr. Rockefeller began to develop this area, he acquired strategic pieces of property across the river along 11 miles of the New Jersey Palisades, commencing in a northerly direction from the George Washington Bridge. It was his intention to provide an isolated setting for the cloisters within a park removed from city structures and to assure undisturbed views of the landscape. So there is a reading of this that says, he put it here because he knew that the land would have been a beautiful view. But there's also an interpretation of this that centers the cloisters in the middle of this story. And I found it interesting that it left out both Kaikit and only added us as this sort of add-on, almost on a whim. So this is the view from our side of the river, looking over at the cloisters and Fort Tryon Park. And I tried to puzzle piece together some sort of timeline, because there's a lot of major projects happening in a small amount of time. So 1900, the Rockefeller family supports the creation of the Palisades. That's when John D. Rockefeller Sr., he's actually buying into the whole Palisades idea. He's investing money. JP Morgan actually invests more money into it. But let's see what happens. So by 1914, the Cloisters collection is created and Kaikit is finished. The Cloisters collection at this point would be would be housed downtown. It wasn't actually in the building that it is today, that has like such stunning views. I believe it was some sort of brownstone downtown. By 1917, Rockefeller bought the Billings property to make Fort Tryon Park. That's the large estate that the Billings family had in uptown New York, and that is where Fort Tryon Park is today. So then there's this uncomfortable gap. By 1930, or actually like the early 1930s, Fort Tryon Park is donated to New York City, and the Palisades land is donated by 1933. I believe they're around the same year. But there's an uncomfortable gap in there. By 1938, the Cloisters opens in Fort Tryon Park. And by 1940, the PIPC celebrates 40 years of existence. So when I was looking at all these records, there wasn't much to explain that gap. That's a massive gap when you're holding on to a piece of property for over 10 years. So I dug further because I wasn't exactly sure what to do with this information. And someone might not be muted. Sorry, just letting you know. Just make sure you're muted, folks. So this is where I was able to find the twist to the story. Wealthy financer, so this is the Landmarks Preservation Commission about Fort Tryon Park, and it seems like it's a little bit more well-researched. Wealthy financier and philanthropist John D. Rockefeller Jr. had long been interested in purchasing the property around Fort Tryon, having an attachment to it since childhood, when he had taken walks there with his father. With the intention of creating a park, Rockefeller purchased the estates in January 1917 for a total of just under $2 million. Oh, if only I had $2 million to buy a park with. I would love that. On June 13th, 1917, he announced to Mayor John P. Mitchell his decision to give the property to the city as a park, with the following stipulations: that the city improve and maintain the park. This actually is pretty common. He goes ahead, this is usually a stipulation going forward. Whenever he does a big land grant, he says, you gotta be in charge of undeveloping the property. The Billings Mansion and Estate is a large estate. It would take a lot of money to tear down the buildings, tear down the grounds, and then landscape it differently. That the city connected by land purchases to Fort Washington Park. That I don't ever believe happened. I've walked on foot between the parks, but I believe there is some section of city in between them. And that the deed be given to the Palisades Interstate Park Commission. So that's sort of a surprise for me at that moment, because not only are we a player in this story, but actually it's almost flipped on its head, where they were supposed to be an extension of us. And I always found that surprising. And it goes on to say, the plan was to connect this park by a ferry at Dyckman Street to the New Jersey Palisades, also preserved through land acquisitions by the Palisades Interstate Park Commission. The city accepted the offer. However, Mitchell's successor, John Hyland, was forced to refuse the gift due mainly to the unimproved nature of the land, which would have been very expensive to develop for park purposes. That's exactly what I said. You can kind of see how a mayor would kind of calculate those costs in his head and quickly turn down the property. And the fact that the Palisades Commission was legally prohibited from accepting the deed. Thus, the park idea lay dormant for 10 years. One thing that you should know about the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, in our charter, it stipulates we can only own land on the western side of the Hudson River. So we would never be able to take that property. I don't think that Rockefeller Jr. read the small print of that, or maybe he was hoping that, rules could be bended for that purpose. I find all of this fascinating because it explains the gap. If you folks remember, there was a gap of over 10 years, and now it's explained. There was legalese going on, sort of a ping pong match between our park, the mayor of New York City, Rockefeller, and it seemed like it was becoming difficult. So in 1917, when he's originally buying this property, you can actually see that he's already planning on creating a ferry system. You can see over here, among the plans under consideration is connecting a Fort Tryon region with the interstate park system by means of ferry boats, the maintenance of which may be guaranteed by a private donor or by the municipality. There is now a ferry boat service which takes passengers from the foot of Dyckman Street to the Palisades Park, and in the summertime it is much used by campers and those on a recreation bent. Mr. Billings has a yacht landing at the foot of the hill, which could be utilized in any large scheme of river transit. This is just one of the ways that you can kind of see how important boat travel was back then. We've kind of lost touch with that, both through the George Washington Bridge and our car-centric society. You wouldn't even think of putting a ferry boat in between. To my mind, it's something akin to the Staten Island ferry, where you would go to one area that's state-run and then go across to another area that's state-run. You can see the ingenuity in it. And it would be far easier to do that than, I believe the Dyckman Street ferry was for profit. So you would actually save some money and make sure more people could get across to our park. As well as the only other way to get to the park would be by going up Metro North eventually, or its predecessor, and then going across on the Yonkers Ferry or its predecessor. So there were many ways to get to the park by boat. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you can kind of see why Fort Tryon and the Palisades are linked, and you can see why that link has been forgotten. So, filling in the gaps. So by 1900, the Rockefeller family supports the creation of the PIP. And I've added in red some things that often people who are just generalizing the story, sometimes they don't remember. So filling it in, along with many other donors, the governors of New York and New Jersey, and the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs. So by only highlighting one person in the story, you're actually erasing this fantastic showing of civilian support for this project. You can never put the blame, not blame, but the credit on one individual. This was definitely a group effort, and you can't even put the credit on one state. It was a bi-state effort as well. By 1914, the cloister's collection is created and Kykuit is finished. By 1917, Rockefeller buys the property to make Fort Tryon Park. And then this is where that gap comes in. He offers it to the Palisades Interstate Park. We have to say no. The mayor of New York gets involved. They say no. So by the 1920s, the PIP cannot acquire Fort Tryon Park. The land sits. And then in the 1920s, you start to see shell accounts pop up. Rockefeller shell accounts. He's buying up land on top of the Palisades. Because you never say that if you're the richest man in America, possibly the world, in today's money, Rockefeller Jr. would have been a trillionaire. You never say that it's Rockefeller who wants your property. You just use a shell account, so they can't say, I'll do it, but only for $10 billion. By 1925, the Met purchases the Cloisters collection. In 1930, Fort Tryon Park is donated to New York City, and that PIP land is donated on top of our cliffs. So John D. Rockefeller Jr. is incredibly involved in this sort of second wind of acquiring land, especially on top of the cliffs. By 1935, the Cloisters building is finished in Fort Tryon Park. In part, it's reconstructed using monasteries and other really cool historic artifacts from Europe. Definitely check it out if you haven't been. It's a beautiful place. In 1938, the Cloisters opens in Fort Tryon Park to the public. And by 1940, the PIPC celebrates 40 years of existence. So this is actually the Met's perspective on the subject. I was able to find this online. It's written by a man who's involved with, he's in the higher echelons of interpretation at the Cloisters. I believe his background is in medieval art, but he has a really good article. The oft-repeated anecdote that Rockefeller also bought all of the Palisades to preserve the splendid view from the Cloisters is not entirely correct. The land acquisition was actually made possible through the generosity of another of the Metropolitan's most beneficent patrons, J. Pierpont Morgan, over 30 years before either the Cloisters or the park that surrounds it existed. So from this, you can actually see that they aren't conflating the two Rockefellers. They aren't going for that scandalous story, but they are falling for another pitfall, and that's the great man of history pitfall. It wasn't only J. Pierpont Morgan involved in that story, although he did provide financial support. You know, it wasn't just J.P. Morgan building a park, although, again, like I said, a lot of parks are founded by one person, especially some sort of wealthy individual. This park was a little bit different. We're always an outlier, right, Christina? It is our talent. So John D. Rockefeller Jr. spent more money on the top of the Palisades land than he did on any other project, including buying up all the land in Yellowstone, creating Acadia National Park as a national park. That was his private estate beforehand. Colonial Williamsburg. He spends more money on the 12 miles of cliff tops. And here in the American Society of Landscape Architects from 1938, oh, Francis, you're drawing. They actually explain it a little bit. To Mr. Rockefeller, the beauty of the Palisades has ever been synonymous with the, oh, Francis is drawing again. Synonymous with the beauty of the Hudson and the constant threat of its defacement, nothing more than sacrilege. So you can see that he genuinely thinks that it's not necessarily just the view from one place that matters, but it's the physical beauty of the Palisades themselves from any view. And I think that that's a slight nuance, but it's worth explaining. Also, one thing that he had in mind was a parkway. That was early on in his mind. In 1933, the second that he's donating land to the Palisades, he's explaining that it will be used for a parkway. And he didn't just suddenly have this idea. That's one of the reasons that he bought up that land. It's not necessarily the most fancy of reasons to buy a property. It's a lot nicer to say that he bought it for a grand view from one place or another. But this was a major wish of his. Today, we kind of look down on parkway projects or highway projects because of the negative impact that cars have had on our planet and our climate. But back in the day, this was actually something that was in John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s mind, democratizing park systems. It was a way to make sure people from the city could get out and explore our beautiful country. So I'm sure he might have a different opinion today, but at the time, that was what his goal was. You can also see, if you were so interested, here are all those major donors that I was talking about. I believe JP Morgan is the one who donated the most amount of money, but you see John D. Rockefeller Jr. right below him. And again, these are people who donated money a generation before. 30 years later, John D. Rockefeller Jr. is using all of this property that he just donated to the park, and it is his wish to create a parkway closely adjacent to the edge of the Palisades. So this is what he's publicizing. This is very public knowledge. He really is hell-bent on this parkway project. And one of the reasons for that is this fear of development. This we saw in 1909, what they were talking about, and it was mainly destroying the Palisades themselves. By the next generation, they're worried about the tops of the Palisades. And again, that's where he came in to buy all that property. So this is what the Met's website says about us. It is actually live on their history page. You can visit it right now. Following J. Pierpont Morgan's purchase of 12 miles of the New Jersey Palisades in 1901 to preserve the cliffs and shoreline from excessive quarrying, Rockefeller in 1933 donated some 700 additional acres of the Palisades Plateau to preserve the view from the Met cloisters. So there's a few pitfalls this falls into. To make it a little easier, I highlighted information that's incorrect. Actually, JP Morgan didn't buy 12 miles of the Palisades. He only bought out one of their largest quarries. And he actually did that in 1900, not 1901, as well as this last section, to preserve the view from the Met cloisters. How it's worded kind of centers the Met in the story, which is understandable. This is their website and their own history. But they're the ones mentioning us in there. So I hope this is only an experience that I went through, trying to dig through all of these different historic materials and what people are interpreting it as. There's no ego in this fight. I don't have beef with the method. I promise I don't. Right here, I kind of rewrote it to make it more accurate. And the different writing is in red. Following the creation of the Palisades Interstate Park in 1900 to preserve the cliffs, or you could even say the Palisades Interstate Park Commission in 1900 to preserve the cliffs and shoreline from excessive quarrying, Rockefeller in 1933 donated some 700 additional acres of the Palisades Plateau to stop the risk of development along the cliffs and to create a new parkway. So that's a little bit more on brand with what his intentions were with this land. One person that seems to be left out of their version of it is George Perkins, who was actually JP Morgan's right-hand man, but he was actually our first president of the Palisades Interstate Park Commission. He apparently sat down with these major quarries every day for months, negotiating and making sure that these quarries would stop. At the time, these quarries were large employers. They employed over 300 men. So this was a very stressful situation, I believe, for everyone involved. And it was through JP Morgan's eventual financial contributions that we were able to buy out these quarries. But again, it was going into state trusted funds with state contributions as well as contributions by citizens, including the Women's Federation. New Jersey Women's Federation donated a lot of money to us as well. So I was excited because I actually emailed the Met about this erroneous information on their website, and they actually mentioned us in a post. And here are some beautiful views from their side looking at us. You were able to see us looking at them, and now we're seeing the reverse. And you can see how much you can enjoy the building itself in this context, because there aren't any developed buildings across the river, and it is a beautiful view from the cloisters themselves. You will still see the George Washington Bridge from where they are, so it's not necessarily undisturbed, and you will see modern construction as well. But as for our land, you can't see much. You can see they actually tried to amend the information. They were able to add in an interstate park commission formed by the governors of New York and New Jersey appealed to Morgan to fund the purchase of 12 miles of shoreline and vertical rise in 1901 to protect it from further damage and development. Around the same time, Rockefeller was independently purchasing land along the plateau that was eventually used to create the Palisades Interstate Parkway. The preservation of the Palisades themselves and the unspoiled views we still enjoy are the result of forethought and years of effort. This is a particularly beautiful season in which to appreciate them. So this is a wonderful addition. You can see people are actually, doing further research than just certain articles that I think a lot of people were sourcing without looking further into. There are still some things to nitpick, but I think that it's an absolutely wonderful direction to go in. So one of the questions I had, because I wasn't just mad or confused or offended or anything when I found this information was wrong. What I wanted to know was, why was the real story forgotten? And that's actually a kind of a complicated question. And how did the other question, it's sort of like two sides of a coin. Why was the story forgotten? And how did this myth become so prevalent? I think, and this is just my theory, if anyone has any other ideas, please share them with me. I highly, highly believe that this has to do with the fact that New Yorkers are now cut off from our parks. They aren't swimming, they aren't kayaking, they aren't canoeing over in the same way that they used to. The Palisades Interstate Park in New Jersey used to be for New Yorkers, and emphasis on for. This was a bi-state agency when it was first founded, and people came over in the millions just to use our public park. And it wasn't just our view that they enjoyed, they actually came in person. Here you can see all the people that had canoes in New York City that came over. And if they couldn't afford a canoe in one of these canoe clubs down all around Manhattan, they actually came over in the ferry boats. Here we have another wonderful photo of someone who canoed over. Thousands cross river on the new Palisades ferry. Exercises attending the opening of the Dyckman Street ferry. George W. Perkins speaking from the platform at the landing. Remember George Perkins? He's still doing it. Even all the way through 1920, that's when he passes away. He's heavily, heavily, heavily involved. Whenever you see a grand opening or some sort of dedication, he's attending. Today, if you want to visit something of his memorial, we actually built Perkins Memorial Tower for him in the Bear Mountain section, and it's actually a wonderful hike as well. Here we have another view. If I were to bet, I would bet $10 everyone in this photo is actually from New York City. Here we have a view from above of the Yonkers Ferry. So there's two ferries running. bringing people over. They're actually using our beaches to swim in. New York crosses the Hudson to get back to nature. So you're seeing that not only are we an icon for people who are impoverished and they need a day out and water's wet, it doesn't matter if it's a little bit polluted or the Hudson, they're coming over. And now we're becoming sort of a cultural icon by the 1920s. Here's another view. I love this. Long story short, there's another presentation where we just focus on this paper, and it's a great one. So here we have John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s own words on the subject. My primary purpose in acquiring this property was to preserve the land lying along the top of the Palisades from any use inconsistent with your, they mean the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, ownership and protection of the Palisades themselves. It has also been my hope that a strip of this land of adequate width might ultimately be developed as a parkway. And specifically, as you can see a little bit later, for industrial recovery and the relief of unemployment. So one thing that the Cloisters, Fort Tryon Park, and our park have in common is that they were sort of opened for business, well, for proverbially, we were already there, but in the 1930s. And that's not a coincidence. It has to do with the Great Depression. So the WPA, the CCC, they were finally able to do the work of undeveloping Fort Tryon Park. They were able to tear down things and actually pave roads and landscape, just like just like John D. Rockefeller Jr. wanted. And they were also able to create all sorts of wonderful things for us as a park, including one of the hopes was that they would actually create our parkway. Here are our boys on our CCC boys, they were called. This is on one of our lower sections, the Henry Hudson Drive, on our side of the river. And unfortunately, they were able to map out where they wanted the road, the eventual parkway to be built, but we couldn't get the funds. There's a long story there, but we could not get the funds from the federal government for this project until a lot later. So by the time the Great Depression ended, we still did not have a parkway. It wouldn't actually be until 1957 that the parkway was constructed. So one of the things that I think also happened, even though this was one of the major reasons why John D. Rockefeller Jr. bought up that property, since it's so divorced, that timeline is so long from when we bought that or when that property was given to us and when a parkway was founded, I think a lot of the public sort of severed that connection, you know? It's a very long span of time. Long story short, we finally were accepted by the federal government. We accepted a grant. I believe this is probably some sort of Eisenhower money involved with this project, and that was why it was able to be completed. So, like I was saying, from the 1930s until the 1950s is a lot of time. Enough to start rumors. The intention of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s donation of land was severed from the implementation of his gift. By the time the 1950s roll around, the rivers are incredibly polluted. No one is swimming anymore. Our last bathing beach closes by the late 40s. So all of a sudden, we aren't seeing the same numbers of people. So I say here, we are a missing puzzle piece in John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s large-scale landscape experiment. You can see in an early map of the park, or sorry, an early map of Manhattan, we are actually listed on the side over here. In later maps, and I'm making generalizations myself now, you can kind of see that we aren't even on the map anymore. It's not like a tourist would ever come to us, you know? Sometimes people do, but for the most part, the New York experience is a little different than it was back then. we're not accessible anymore. You can't take a ferry to us. And this is kind of a joke. I saw this and I really liked it. You can see right over here at the George Washington Bridge. We're right here next to the Great Lakes. But so this is in 1931. You can see that over 2 million people visited the park during that time. And you can see an additional millions who simply passed through the park in automobiles to and from the ferries or other park drives. So millions and millions of people are using our ferries to get through the park and to other places, but we're still sort of involved. They know us. By 1950, it was 3 million, I believe, in all of the parks. We closed our swimming beaches. It was not, we are seeing numbers dip. This is in all parks, not just in ours. And by 1956, it was a very disappointing year. In the New Jersey section, they dropped from like around 2 million to 1.5 million. And we'll start to see that dip. All of our annual reports start seeing how bad the pollution is along the river and how we are seeing less and less people for a little bit. Those numbers eventually climb again, but it's interesting to see what those numbers look like. You can see those numbers start to climb again by the 70s, but the 50s took a big hit. This number doesn't make any sense. I think that they just started counting this year, but you can see why people would forget us, because there's about a generation where people are coming to the park less. And so they're only seeing us from their side of the river, and they're telling people, Rockefeller bought up all that land just for us. But they're forgetting that they used to come here, and they used to be able to swim, and they used to buy concessions and kayak and have fun. And I hope that they're discovering us again. So the Rockefellers continue to be involved to this day in efforts of conservation countrywide. Even though they can't see most sites from their window, I really hope that they continue their legacy of preservation, conservation. And if anyone has any questions, that's the end of what I wanted to say. I'd be very happy to answer. I know it's a lot of, it's kind of convoluted and it was a lot of reading, but yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Francesca. A couple of people have some fun anecdotes in the comments.
I'd
Karen,
love to see it.
yeah, Karen says that her father, who's now 96, used to go camping in Fort Lee with the Boy Scouts. And then Karen's grandmother, who was born in 1900 and lived in the Bronx, used to go by ferry to the Palisades Park and even met Karen's grandmother there in 1918.
Oh, that's so sweet. And you know, that actually tracks my great-grandmother. When my family said that they were moving to Closter and buying a house in Closter, my great-grandmother turned and said, "What? That's where I used to go camping." I didn't know they had houses there. And it turns out she was talking about the Palisades. So you can kind of see that, like, you know, that span where people used to come here so often, and then because they didn't have that ferry or that very accessible way to get here anymore, you can see that we just become sort of a memory or an anecdote. Thankfully, we're starting to see those populations come back, especially during COVID. That was when we got basically the most amount of people we've had in the park since the Great Depression. So it's always a nice thought that we're here for people when they need us.
Yeah, that's great. Do you know where most people visit from today?
A lot of people do visit us, especially by bicycles. They definitely visit from Manhattan. A lot of people who use our picnic areas actually come from either Jersey City or what is it, Hudson County?
Yeah.
a lot of people from there think of us as their backyard. And we're so happy to have them there. As far as hikers, they actually do tend to be more New York City or Bergen County folks.
Mhm. Let's see. There's a question here. Do you think there might be a chance for a ferry system to come back?
I'm on board, and I've actually spoken to people in Fort Tryon Park as well, and they're also on board for something like that. I think one of the issues would be liability. I think most vendors or people that we would reach out to would take one look at, some sort of Staten Island ferry project and be like, oh yeah, I'm out. But I would absolutely love to see something like that become reality, just because, that's probably the future, getting away from cars.
Yeah. Andrew asked, do you know anything about the Rockefellers and the Tallman State Park, which is just north of the Palisades Interstate Park?
So I know less about Tallman State Park. I know that it was purchased fairly early in our history by like 1950. It's already part of our park system. Um, but unfortunately, right at the state line, that's where my knowledge drops off as well. But one interesting anecdote I've recently heard about Tallman State Park is that's actually the furthest point from the Russian embassy that Soviet ambassadors and their families could go. So they would actually drive on a bus, like drive them out on a bus to Tallman, and they'd picnic with their families. And that's just one anecdote. I don't have any proof of that, but I thought that was an interesting little anecdote.
And Alex asked, is there a time frame for when the Englewood Cliffs entrance will reopen?
That is a really good question, Alex. I don't know very much myself, but if you want more information on the damage that we got and some of the steps we're taking, I actually have a program on Thursday at the Closter Nature Center at around 7 p.m. that will answer those questions.
Any other questions, comments, oft-repeated anecdotes?
I would
There.
love to hear more stories. Because again, this is something that it's sort of this 100-year-long game of telephone for me. And I found it really fascinating to sort of dig through, because you can see you start to see that some of the sources you're looking at actually copied off of each other instead of finding like those earlier sources.
All right. Well, this has been fabulous. So thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and a special thanks to Francesca for this fascinating presentation. And we do hope to see all of you again soon, either in person at the library or at the park or at an upcoming virtual program. Have a good night, everyone.